A man was on his knees in the snow. He was not a small man. Edmund Harlow had shoulders wide enough to fill a door frame, and hands that had shaped timber into 30 homes across the frontier territory. Men stepped aside when he walked into a room, not because he asked them to, but because the weight of him, the simple and solid fact of him, made space feel finite. He had never knelt before anything that did not have an altar in front of it. But he was kneeling now. His bare palms were pressed flat against the bark of a cottonwood tree so enormous that it looked less like something that had grown and more like something that had always been. A column of ancient gray wood rising from the frozen earth as if the land itself had pushed it up from somewhere deep and permanent. His shoulders shook. His breath came in ragged clouds that the winter swallowed without gratitude. From a narrow fissure near the base of the tree, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, a current of warm air drifted out into the killing cold and touched his face with the gentleness of a hand laid on a fevered brow. There was a woman inside that tree. She had not found it by chance, and the person who had, in a way, led her there was the last person she would ever have expected. But that is not where the story begins. 3 months earlier, there had been no warmth and no revelation. There had only been a notice and a nail. The nail was driven through the center of a single sheet of paper and into the pine door of a company shack at the edge of a small frontier mining town. The kind of place where the church and the general store faced each other across a mud street, where everyone knew everyone else's business, and where a woman's reputation was the only currency she could not earn back once it was spent. A widow stood in the doorway and read the notice by the light of a tallow candle. Her lips moved slightly as she read, a habit from childhood, from the years when her father had held books open on his knee and she had sounded out the words in a language that was not yet entirely her own. Her name was Clara Voss. She was 28 years old. She had crossed an ocean and half a continent to stand in this doorway, and the notice informed her, in the clipped and indifferent language of company policy, that she was to vacate by sundown. Her husband Henry had been dead for 3 weeks. He had been a careful man, Henry Voss, quiet and deliberate, the kind of miner who listened to what the earth was telling him before he ever raised a pick. And the earth had been telling him something about the shale in the main tunnel, a wrongness in the grain, a brittleness his hands could feel even through the handle of his tools. He had written it down. He had put the warning in writing and given it to the foreman, and the foreman had told him to keep digging. The foreman's name was Silas Crane. Clara had known about the shale. She had seen it herself, had recognized the fracture pattern from everything her father had taught her about the language of stone. She had opened her mouth to tell Henry not to go back, and she had closed it again because the shift paid double, and they needed the money, and because a wife who tells her husband she knows more than his foreman is a wife who has decided to start a particular kind of war. Henry had gone back. The shale had come down, and Clara had carried the silence of that unopened mouth like a stone in her chest ever since. She folded Henry's letter of warning and pressed it into the Bible on the shelf. Then she went to find Silas Crane. She did not raise her voice. She stood before him in the cold morning and spoke the way her father had taught her to speak when the stakes were high, low even, without decoration. Henry wrote it down, Mr. Crane. He warned you in writing. I kept the letter." Silas Crane's face went white for exactly one moment. One flash of naked fear that she filed away in the part of her memory where she kept things that mattered. Then the white became red, and the fear became something harder. He leaned close. His voice dropped to the register that men use when they want a sentence to feel like a closed door. "Dead men's wives don't last long out here," he said. "Be smart." It was not advice. It was a border crossing disguised as advice. She held his eyes for 3 full heartbeats. Then she turned and walked back through the cold, and she did not look behind her. The community's response was not cruel. That was, in some ways, the worst part of it. It was simply the first quiet step in the process of forgetting her. Dorothea Whitmore, the minister's wife, opened the parsonage door with red eyes and the expression of a woman who had already made a decision she was ashamed of. She leaned forward across the threshold as if she might physically reach out. Then she stepped back. "I wish I could," she said, and her voice broke along a seam that had clearly been cracking for days. Clara understood. She had lived long enough among these people to know that their mercy was real but rationed, dispensed according to a careful arithmetic of risk and precedent that left no room for exceptions. Dorothea was not heartless. Dorothea was trapped. The men who came for her possessions that evening were not cruel either. They were efficient. They carried out the stove, the chest, the bedroll, the small stack of Henry's tools, and they set each item in the snow with the brisk impersonality of men performing a function the town had decided was necessary. Clara stood in the cold and watched, and the town watched her from behind its windows, from behind the warm glow of fires that would burn all night in houses that would still be standing come morning. She saw the complex, quickly suppressed flicker of something on a few of those faces. Not guilt exactly, but its quieter cousin. The discomfort of witnessing something wrong that isn't quite wrong enough to stop. The stove was gone by morning. The boot prints in the snow told her who had taken it. A double row of hobnails across the ball of each print, a pattern she had seen for 3 years on the floors of the mine office. Silas Crane had his boots resoled that way. He said it gave him better grip in the tunnels. It also left a signature that could not be denied. Clara did not lie down in the snow. She considered it, seriously, not as a passing thought, but with the full and deliberate weight of a woman assessing her options. She stood beside the ruins of her belongings in the deepening cold, and she held Henry's old coat against her body, and she breathed in the last traces of him that the wool still carried. Then the wind shifted. It came from the northwest and passed through a narrow canyon a mile beyond the town, and as it moved through that channel of stone, it produced a sound, deep, resonant, the sound of moving air passing over a hollow space. Her father's voice arrived in her memory without invitation. "A hollow tree is not rot, little one. It is a memory, and a memory can be a shelter." She had seen the cottonwood. 1 month earlier, gathering deadfall in the canyon, she had come upon it, 12 feet across at its base, ancient and ignored by the loggers because it was too massive to fell cleanly and too irregular to mill. A worthless tree by every measure the men of this place applied. She picked up the bedroll, the axe, the tinderbox, Henry's folding knife, a sack of dried provisions. She reached down and took the small hand of her daughter, who had been standing quietly beside her in the snow, watching everything with the enormous and patient eyes of a child who has learned that the adults will eventually explain. Nora was 7 years old. She was wearing every piece of clothing she owned, and she did not cry, and she did not ask where they were going. She simply tightened her fingers around her mother's hand and walked. The journey took 2 hours. The canyon walls rose on either side, and the cottonwood appeared in the last gray light of the day. A shape more than a tree, a massive vertical presence that Clara felt before she fully saw it. She found the opening on the leeward side, half hidden behind a tangle of dead brush. She hacked the brush away. She peered into the darkness beyond. It was absolute. It pressed against her open eyes like a physical weight. She squeezed through. The wind stopped, not gradually, instantly, completely, as if someone had closed a door between her and the world. The silence was so sudden and so total that she staggered, her body still braced against a force that was no longer there. The tinder struck on the fourth attempt. A small flame bloomed, and the interior of the tree revealed itself. A chamber nearly 8 feet across, the walls curving inward like the hull of an overturned boat. The floor, a bed of soft and ancient wood pulp. The air smelled of earth and time. Nora stood beside her and turned in a slow circle. "Mama," she said, "are we living inside a tree?" Clara looked at the curved walls, the domed ceiling, the darkness that was, for the first time in weeks, a darkness that belonged to her. "We are living inside something stronger than any house in that town." Nora considered this. Then she reached out and pressed her small palm flat against the wood, and there, just above the entrance, half swallowed by decades of slow growth, Clara saw what the firelight had revealed. 2 letters carved deep into the bark, and beside them, a small 5-pointed star. E.M. Someone had been here before her. Someone had found this tree, and used this tree, and survived long enough to leave their mark above the door. Clara raised her hand and pressed it against the carving. The wood was cold, but it was solid. And solid, she had learned, was enough to begin. The first night inside the tree, Clara did not sleep. She lay on the bed of soft wood pulp with Nora curled against her side and listened to the wind work itself into a fury against the canyon walls. She could hear it searching, the way wind does when it is determined, moving along surfaces, probing for gaps, testing every joint and seam. But the cottonwood did not offer it anything. 3 feet of fibrous ancient wood stood between her daughter and the thing that wanted to kill them, and the tree gave nothing away. Nora's breathing slowed into the deep and untroubled rhythm of a child who has decided, on some fundamental level below conscious thought, that she is safe. Clara lay still and listened to it, and for a long time that was enough. By the second day, the tinderbox was running low, and the provisions were nearly gone. She had packed for survival, not for comfort. Dried beans, a strip of salt pork, a heel of hard bread that had gone the texture of carved wood. She rationed it with the precision of a woman who had done the arithmetic and did not like the answer. Nora got the larger portion at every meal. Clara ate what was left, which was sometimes very little, and when Nora asked if she was hungry, she said she had already eaten, and she said it with enough conviction that the child accepted it. For 2 days. On the morning of the 3rd day, Nora woke before dawn and sat up and looked at her mother in the thin gray light filtering through the entrance. She did not say anything. She simply reached into her coat pocket and produced the last piece of salt pork, the one Clara had given her the night before, and placed it in her mother's hand. Clara looked at the small piece of meat. She looked at her daughter's face. You always say that, Nora said, but your hands shake when you think I'm not looking. 7 years old. The arithmetic of a child who had been paying closer attention than anyone realized. Clara ate the salt pork. It tasted like the most honest thing she had eaten in weeks. The snares were Henry's design. Simple, effective, the kind of trap a man builds when he has learned that the most reliable tools are the ones with the fewest parts. Clara had watched him set them 100 times in the hills above the old claim. She had watched his hands work the cord into the particular configuration that he called his father's knot, a loop with a specific tension that closed fast and held clean. She set 3 snares along the creek bed on the 3rd afternoon, moving low against the bank, choosing spots where the snow showed the fine and scattered tracks of small animals. Her fingers were clumsy with cold. She worked them against each other between sets, forcing warmth back into the joints. And she thought of her father, who had set snares in a very different country, in forests that smelled of pine and iron and the particular mineral sharpness of Cornish soil. He had taught her not the knot itself, but the principle behind it. A snare does not catch by force. It catches by patience. You build the path you want the animal to take, and then you wait for the animal to want what you want. She checked the snares at first light on the 4th day. The 3rd one held a rabbit, small and stiff with cold, its dark eyes glazed white. She stood over it in the gray morning and felt something unwind in her chest. A tension she had been carrying for 4 days without fully naming. She pressed the rabbit against her ribs and breathed out. Back in the hollow, she skinned it by the light of a small fire built from the last of the tinder and a handful of dried bark. She made soup from the bones in the tin cup, boiling and reboiling the water until it carried some faint ghost of nutrition. She gave Nora the broth and ate the liver herself, raw, the way her father had taught her. The organs first, he had said. They carry what the muscle does not. Nora drank the broth and wrinkled her nose at the smell and said nothing about the liver, which was a kind of grace. The fire was the problem, not the warmth itself. The hollow held temperature better than anything Clara had built or lived in. The thick walls absorbing heat and releasing it back in a slow and even exchange that defied every principle she had seen applied to the cabins in town. She understood, intellectually, why it worked. Her father had explained it to her once, sitting beside a hollow oak in the old country, his hands wrapped around a mug of tea. A wall that fights the cold invites attack, he had said. A wall that holds heat is a vessel, and a vessel keeps what it receives. The walls of the cottonwood were a vessel. Even after the fire burned low, even in the deepest part of the night, the interior held a temperature that was not comfortable by any measure a warm house would recognize, but that was entirely survivable. The neutral stillness of sheltered earth, cold enough to see your breath, not cold enough to die. But she needed a proper stove. The small fire she built on the floor of the hollow was a temporary solution, a desperate one, controlled only by constant attention and the absence of wind. It filled the chamber with smoke if she wasn't careful. It consumed wood at a rate she couldn't sustain. She needed the stove, and the stove was in Silas Crane's possession, somewhere in the town she had left. But before the stove, she needed a platform. And before the platform, she needed stones. The work began on the 5th morning. Clara had learned to read the creek bed the way her father had taught her to read a rock face, not for what it showed, but for what it withheld. Flat stones of the right thickness, neither too porous to hold weight, nor too dense to split under thermal stress. She carried them in Henry's canvas rucksack, 3 or 4 at a time, the straps cutting into her shoulders through the layers of wool. Nora came with her on the 3rd trip. She was not asked to help. She simply appeared beside her mother at the creek bank and began selecting stones with the same careful and evaluative attention Clara was using, holding each one up to examine its face, tapping it with a knuckle to hear its answer. "This one," she said, offering a flat gray piece the size of a dinner plate. Clara took it and ran her thumb across the surface. Even grain, no visible fracture lines, the right weight for its size. She looked at her daughter. "Where did you learn to do that?" Nora considered the question. "You were doing it. I watched." Clara put the stone in the rucksack without another word. By the end of the week, the platform was finished. A level base of fitted stone, shimmed with chips of hardwood where the ground beneath was uneven, mortared with clay from the creek bank. It was a piece of work she looked at for a long time when it was done, running her hands across the joints, checking the level with the small brass instrument that had been Henry's. The platform was ready. The stove was not here. She went back to town. It was Nora who found the dog. They were coming back from the creek on an afternoon when the light was flat and gray and the air had the particular quality of cold that presses against the skin rather than moving through it. Clara was carrying the rucksack and thinking about the clay chimney lining she would need to build before she could safely run the stove, and Nora had fallen a few steps behind, which was unusual. Clara turned. Nora was crouched in the snow beside the tangle of willow brush at the edge of the creek, very still, making a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a hum. The soft and barely audible sound a child makes when trying not to startle something frightened. From the brush, 2 eyes watched, dark, exhausted, set in a face that was all sharp angles and faded color. A dog, or what had once been a dog. The kind of medium-sized indeterminate creature that looks like it was assembled from the leftover parts of 3 other dogs, and then left out in the weather for several seasons. Its ribs were visible under a coat that might have been brown or might have been gray, or might have simply been the color of things that have been outside for too long. It did not growl. It did not move toward them. It simply looked with the patient and careful attention of an animal that has learned to evaluate every situation before committing to it. Nora looked up at Clara. She did not speak. She did not need to. Clara looked at the dog. She looked at her daughter. She thought about the food they didn't have and the space they barely had enough of and the very long list of things they needed that did not include another mouth. "He's like us," Nora said very quietly. "He doesn't have anywhere to go." Clara closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them. "1 week," she said. "If he can't pull his own weight by then." But the dog had already stood up and walked to her feet and sat down, with the decisive confidence of an animal that has just concluded a negotiation in its favor. Nora named him Ember because of the color she claimed to see in his eyes when the firelight caught them. Clara privately thought it was also because the name suited a small and persistent source of warmth in a cold place. The dog proved, within 24 hours, to have a talent for sleeping in exactly the right position to radiate heat toward Nora. while simultaneously managing to take up no more space than his body actually occupied, a skill that Clara found she could not fault. The skeptics arrived on a Wednesday. Clara heard them coming before she saw them, 2 men from the town, their boots loud on the frozen creek bed, their voices carrying across the canyon with the unself-conscious volume of people who have never had to be quiet about anything. She was working on the willow frame for the inner door when they appeared at the edge of the clearing. She recognized one of them, Bart Cullen, who ran the general store, and had the particular quality of a man who has confused the confidence of commerce for wisdom about everything else. The other was younger, raw-boned, with the restless energy of someone who had come looking for entertainment. They stood at the entrance to the clearing and looked at the cottonwood and at the cleared area around it, at the stone platform visible through the narrow opening, at the thin thread of smoke from the small fire inside. "Well," Bart said, "she's actually in there." The younger man crouched down and peered through the entrance with the expression of someone examining an animal in a trap. "It's going to come down on her. First real wind, and that trunk's going to split. Assuming she makes it that long." Bart's voice was not cruel, precisely. It was the voice of a man delivering a verdict he genuinely believed, which was in some ways worse than cruelty. "I'm giving it 2 more weeks, 3 if she gets the stove back." They discussed the probable timeline of her failure as if she were a structural problem they were assessing, as if she were not there. Clara continued weaving willow stems through the frame. Her hands moved in the steady and repetitive rhythm of work, and she did not look up. And she did not speak. And after a while, the men grew bored of the absence of reaction and went back the way they had come. She heard, as they turned, Bart Cullen refer to her shelter as Crane's Folly, and she heard the younger man laugh. She kept weaving. Nora had watched the exchange from the shadow of the entrance, ember pressed against her legs. When the men were gone, she came and stood beside her mother and watched her hands work for a while. "Are we a folly?" she asked. Clara considered the word. It meant, in its older sense, an expensive mistake, a thing built by someone who should have known better. "We are a work in progress," she said. "There's a difference." Callum Whitmore came on a Thursday afternoon, alone, carrying something under his coat in the way that people carry things they don't want to be seen carrying. He was 13, the minister's son, tall for his age, and serious in the way that children become serious when they have spent too much time listening to adults talk about things that matter. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked at the entrance to the hollow and then at Clara, who was mortaring clay into the seam between 2 sections of chimney lining. He did not say anything. He pulled from beneath his coat a cloth-wrapped bundle, dried apple rings, a square of hard cheese, a heel of bread that was fresh enough to still have give in it, and placed it on the flat stone near the entrance. Then he looked at her again, and she looked at him, and something passed between them that was not quite an acknowledgement and not quite a question, but was somewhere in the territory of both. He left. He came back 2 days later with salt wrapped in paper and a small tin of rendered lard that his mother had presumably not given him permission to take. He placed these beside the first gifts without comment. He looked at the chimney lining with the focused attention of a boy who is trying to understand how something works. "The smoke goes up through there," he said. "When it works. When it doesn't, it comes back in, and I have to go outside and cough for a while." He looked at the angle of the flue where it disappeared into the crevice in the heartwood. "The bend is too sharp," he said. "It's making a dead zone. The air doesn't want to turn that fast." Clara stopped mortaring and looked at him. "My father talks about ventilation," Callum said, slightly defensive. "In the church, in winter, how to keep the air moving so the candles don't gutter." She looked at the bend. She had known something was wrong with it, had felt the resistance in the way the smoke hesitated before rising, the way it pooled slightly in the curve before reluctantly continuing upward. She had not been able to name the problem in terms precise enough to solve it. "Show me what you mean," she said. He picked up a stick and drew in the dirt beside the chimney. A curve, then a sharper angle, then an annotation indicating where the air would stall. His drawing was imprecise, but the principle was clear. "Your father," she said. "Does he know you come here?" Callum did not answer, which was, itself, an answer. "You should be careful," she said. "I know," he said, without any particular indication that being careful was something he intended to do. He left, and Clara sat beside the chimney and thought about the bend, and about a boy who had looked at her work and seen a problem she had not solved, and about what it meant that the most useful person in her current situation was 13 years old and operating without his parents' knowledge. She reworked the bend that afternoon, easing it into a curve rather than an angle, widening the channel slightly where it turned. Her fingers read the change in the clay the way she had learned to read everything, by feel, by resistance, by the small signals that materials give when they are being asked to do something they don't want to do. When she lit the fire that evening, the smoke rose without hesitation. It gathered itself at the base of the chimney and moved upward through the curve with the easy confidence of air that has found a path it likes. And it exited through the hidden vent at the top of the hollow and disappeared into the winter sky. Nora watched it go. Ember watched it go. Clara sat on the stone floor with her back against the warm clay wall and felt, for the first time since the notice was nailed to her door, something that was not survival. It was the particular satisfaction of a problem solved by understanding rather than by force. Her father had called it the memory of the fire. She had not understood it as a child. She understood it now. The notice arrived on a morning when the sky was the color of old pewter, and the air had the flat and windless quality that sometimes preceded a change in weather. 2 men came down the canyon trail. One was a stranger, broad-shouldered, with the deliberate walk of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome information. The other was Silas Crane, who stood at the edge of the clearing with his hands in his coat pockets and his face arranged into an expression of businesslike neutrality that did not quite disguise what was beneath it. The stranger explained, in the measured cadence of a man reciting something he has recited before, that the land on which the cottonwood stood fell within the boundaries of an unrecorded company claim, and that Clara's occupation of it constituted trespass. She had 48 hours to vacate. If she failed to do so, the matter would be referred to the county office, which had the authority to remove her by force and to determine whether her living situation constituted adequate care for a minor child. Nora was standing in the entrance to the hollow, Ember pressed against her legs. She was listening to every word. Clara did not look at her daughter. She looked at the document. She read it slowly and fully, moving her lips slightly the way she did when the language mattered. Then she looked up at Silas Crane. He was watching her with the expression of a man who is measuring something. calculating how much she understood, how much she would resist, how much trouble she was going to cause before the arithmetic resolved itself in his favor. 48 hours, she said. That's correct. She folded the document and held it against her side, and she did not say anything else. And after a moment, the two men turned and went back up the canyon trail. That night, after Nora was asleep, Clara sat beside the stove and held the company document in both hands and thought. She thought about Nora's face in the entrance. The particular stillness of a child processing something too large for the frameworks she has. She thought about leaving. She constructed the alternative in careful detail. The wagon east, the towns that might offer work for a widow, the slower and more socially acceptable form of disappearing that Silas had originally suggested. Nora would be warm. Nora would be fed. Nora would not spend another winter in a tree. She stood up. She picked up Henry's coat from the hook she had carved into the wall. Then Nora said something in her sleep. It was not a full sentence. It was the fragmentary murmur of a child in the middle of a dream, the kind of sound that carries feeling without content. But the feeling it carried was unmistakable. It was contentment. Clara stood in the middle of the hollow with Henry's coat in her hands, and she listened to her daughter breathe, and she thought about the stone platform, and the reworked chimney bend, and the clay wall that held warmth like a memory, and the initials carved above the door. She hung the coat back on the hook. She sat down and picked up the document again and read it a second time, looking not at what it said, but at what it didn't say, at the seams in its language. The places where the wording was vague, circular, dependent on assumptions that might not hold under examination. She was still reading when the sound of boots on the frozen canyon floor reached her through the wall. A single set, heavy and deliberate, with the unhurried cadence of a man who has decided to do something he isn't sure he should do. She did not move. She waited. Edmund Harlow's voice came through the outer door, low and even. Mrs. Voss, I've seen the light in there for 3 nights running. I thought it was time I came and saw what I was looking at. Clara set the document on the platform beside the stove. She crossed to the inner door, then the outer. She opened both. Edmund Harlow stood in the entrance to the clearing, exactly as large as she remembered, a man whose presence in an outdoor space somehow made the space feel smaller, not through menace, but through sheer physical displacement. He was looking at the hollow with an expression she could not quite name, not cruelty, not indifference, something more complicated and more uncomfortable to witness. He was looking at her work. "May I come in?" he said. It was not entirely a question. She stepped aside. He had to turn sideways to fit through the outer door, and he moved through the entrance with the careful, self-conscious awareness of a large man in a small space. He straightened inside the chamber and looked around, at the clay walls, the stone platform, the small stove, the willow shelving built along one curved section of the wall, at Nora, asleep in the corner with Ember's head on her feet, at the warmth. He stood in the center of the hollow and said nothing for a long moment. Then he removed his right glove slowly and reached out and pressed his palm flat against the curved clay wall. He left it there. Clara watched him. She had seen this before, this specific arrest of movement, in the faces of people who encounter something that contradicts what they were certain they knew. The small interior rearrangement that follows. Edmund moved his hand slightly, feeling the heat through the clay. He looked at the stove, the small and modest and almost comically inadequate stove, and then back at the wall that it had heated to this temperature. "This shouldn't be possible," he said. "And yet," she said. He looked at her. "My father called it a vessel," she said. "You build to fight the cold, and the cold will always find a way through, because fighting is an invitation. A vessel accepts, it stores, it gives back what it was given, slowly, over time." She paused. "Your houses fight. This tree holds." Edmund lowered his hand. He looked at the platform, at the chimney, at the carefully crafted join between the stovepipe and the clay lining, at the problem she had solved. "There's a man claiming this land belongs to the company," he said. "Yes." "Is it true?" "No." He looked at her steadily. "How do you know?" She picked up the document from the stove platform and handed it to him. He read it the way she had, slowly, looking for the seams. She watched his face as he read and saw the moment he found what she had found. The vagueness in the boundary description, the circular reference in the legal authority cited, the assumption that she would not look closely enough to notice. "I know someone," he said, "who knows how these claims are registered. Who would know whether this parcel has been recorded or not?" Clara said nothing. "He owes me a favor," Edmund said. "Several, actually." He folded the document and held it out to her. "I'll go see him in the morning." She took it. She looked at him. This man who had come to her hollow at night because he could not stop thinking about the smoke, who had placed his hand on her wall and felt what she had built and been changed by it in some way he had not yet named. "Why?" she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "Because I watched you drag that stove through the snow," he said, "and I kept walking. And I haven't stopped thinking about it since." He left before she could respond. Clara stood in the middle of the hollow and listened to his footsteps diminish along the canyon floor. Then she looked at the document in her hand, and then at Nora, who had not woken through any of it, who was still breathing in the deep and trusting rhythm of a child who has decided she is safe. She built up the fire. She sat down. She held her daughter's hand in the dark and listened to the tree breathe around them. Outside, the night was very cold. Inside, the walls held everything they had been given. That was enough. For now, that was enough. But she understood, with the particular clarity that comes only in the quiet hours, when the day's noise has finally spent itself, that enough was not the same as safe, and that the man who had walked away and then come back was only the beginning of something she could feel in the grain of the wood and the language of the earth. Something was coming. She didn't know yet what it would be, but the tree had stood for 100 years, and so, she told herself, would she. Edmund came back the following afternoon with a man named Fitch. Fitch was small and precise, the kind of man who carried a leather folder everywhere he went and whose eyes moved across documents the way a carpenter's hands move across a joint, feeling for the places where things didn't fit. He introduced himself briefly, took the company notice from Clara without ceremony, and read it standing in the clearing while the cold worked at the exposed skin of his face, and he appeared not to notice. He read it twice. Then he folded it along its original creases and looked up. This boundary description references a marker established for a different claim, 2 valleys east of here. Whoever wrote this either made a significant error or was counting on you not to look it up. A pause. The land you're standing on has never been formally recorded by anyone. Clara said nothing. Which means, Fitch continued, that the notice has no standing. You are not trespassing. You are occupying unclaimed land. Edmund was watching Clara's face. She was looking at Fitch, and her expression did not change, and Edmund understood, with the particular insight of someone who has spent 30 years studying structures under stress, that she was not surprised. She had found the seam in the document herself. She had needed Fitch not to discover the problem, but to confirm it in terms that could not be dismissed. She was not a woman who acted on hope. She acted on verification. There's something else, Fitch said. He folded his leather folder. Silas Crane has done this before. The same approach. A boundary claim with imprecise references, delivered quickly, counting on the recipient to be too frightened or too isolated to examine the language. He looked at her steadily. 12 years ago, a woman in similar circumstances. No one came forward for her. She left the territory that winter. The canyon was very quiet. What happened to her? Clara asked. Fitch looked at her with the expression of a man who has learned to be honest about things that are difficult to say. No one knows. She simply stopped being somewhere anyone could find her. Edmund said nothing. He was looking at the bark of the cottonwood, at the carved initials above the entrance that Clara had not explained and he had not asked about. After Fitch left, Edmund stayed and examined the outer door, the willow frame, the layers of woven brush and hardened sod, the clay seal around the edges. The hinge is wrong, he said. The way you've hung it, the weight of the door pulls the left side down in cold weather. Wood contracts. By midwinter, the seal will have a gap the width of 2 fingers on the upper left. Clara looked at the door. She had known something was slightly off in the way it sat in its frame, but had not been able to identify the source. How would you fix it? She said. He fixed it. He worked for an hour with the tools he had apparently decided to bring along, adjusting the hang, adding a wooden wedge that would expand as the door expanded and contract as it contracted, maintaining the seal regardless of temperature. He worked with the efficient and unself-conscious competence of someone for whom the solving of physical problems is a form of native language. Clara worked beside him on a different section of the outer wall, packing additional insulation into the gaps between the sod layers. They did not talk while they worked. It was the silence of 2 people who have each spent a significant portion of their lives working alone, and who have therefore developed a fluency in the quiet language of shared effort. When he finished, he stood back and looked at the door. "Come back tomorrow," Clara said. It was not a request and not quite an order. It was the tone of someone who has assessed a situation and reached a practical conclusion. He came back the following morning, and the morning after that. Nora watched these visits with the focused and evaluative attention of a child who has learned that adults are complicated and that their behavior requires careful study. She spoke to Edmund in short declarative sentences about practical matters, the location of the good flat stones, the direction from which the wind most often came, the feeding habits of the rabbits in the lower canyon. She was assessing him in the only way she knew how, by presenting him with information and watching what he did with it. Ember had no such reservations. The dog had decided, within 30 seconds of Edmund's first visit, that this large and warm-smelling person represented no threat and considerable potential, and had taken to sitting on Edmund's feet whenever he was stationary for more than a few minutes. Edmund bore this with the dignified tolerance of a man who has not spent much time around dogs and is unwilling to admit that he finds it unexpectedly pleasant. It was on a morning 10 days after Fitch's visit that Callum came for the last time. Clara heard him before she saw him, not his usual careful footstep, but something faster and less controlled. The sound of a boy who was moving with urgency and trying to manage the emotions that urgency produces. She was at the entrance, checking the outer doors hang in the cold, and she turned as he came down the canyon trail. His face was red, not from cold. He stopped a few feet from her and stood very straight, the way people stand when they are holding something difficult together by force of posture. "My father knows," he said, "about the visits." Silas Crane told him. A breath. "He says you're filling my head with things that go against what God intends. He says you're dangerous." His jaw was tight. "The point is, I can't come back." Clara looked at him. At the straightness of his spine and the redness of his face, and the notebook she could see the corner of, tucked inside his coat. The notebook he had been filling, visit by visit, with careful drawings of her chimney and her platform, and the double-door system. "Callum," she said. He looked at her. "I understand. I don't agree with him. I think what you've built here is important. I think someone should write it down so it doesn't get lost." He touched the edge of the notebook through his coat. "I already have. Most of it." She held his gaze. "Then it won't be lost." He nodded once with the precise finality of someone closing a chapter. Then he turned and went back up the canyon trail, his boots loud in the crust, his back very straight, and he did not look behind him. Clara stood at the entrance to the hollow and watched him go, and felt the specific grief of watching someone she had relied on walk away from her toward a life she could not follow him into. She went back inside. She was alone, more alone than she had been since the first days, because Callum's visits had become part of the structure of things. She sat beside the stove. Nora was sleeping. Ember was pressed against Nora's side, his eyes half open, watching Clara with the steady and unsentimental attention of an animal that understands more than it lets on. Clara looked at the curved walls, at the shelves she had carved, and the stores she had built, at the clay lining glowing with stored warmth. She looked at the initials above the entrance, just visible in the firelight. E.M. On an impulse she could not entirely explain, she stood up and climbed. The hollow tapered as it rose, the heartwood cavity narrowing toward the crown of the tree, the walls closing in, the darkness deepening. She had explored the lower chamber thoroughly, but had never gone up into the narrower section above, where the cavity thinned to a crack, barely wide enough to move through. She went now with the small tallow candle, pressing herself sideways through the tighter passages, her fingers reading the wood by touch. She found the box in a niche that was only reachable by climbing. A small tin container, rusted along its seam, wedged into a hollow where the heartwood had pulled away from the outer shell. She pried it open with Henry's knife. Inside, a piece of soft hide, perhaps 6 inches square, folded twice, and beneath it, something she had not expected. A small piece of cloth, knotted in a pattern she recognized from childhood, from the old country, from the women of her grandmother's village who had used such knots as a form of written language before written language was available to them. The pattern meant, "This place is safe." She unfolded the hide. On it, scratched with something sharp, was an image. A woman sitting beneath a large tree, a child in her lap, and above them a 5-pointed star. The same star that was carved above the entrance. Clara sat in the narrow dark above her sleeping daughter and held the piece of hide and felt the weight of what she was holding. Not the physical weight, which was almost nothing. The other kind. She thought about what Fitch had told her. A woman 12 years ago who had disappeared. And then she thought about her father and about the story he had told her once, only once near the end of his life, about a woman from the territory beyond the sea who had come back to the old country with knowledge that no one could explain. A woman who had survived something that should not have been survivable, who had brought back with her an understanding of wood and warmth and shelter that she said she had learned from the land itself. Her name, in her father's story, had been Eliza Marin. E.M. Clara sat very still. The woman had not disappeared into death. She had gone home. She had crossed back over the ocean, carrying what she had learned in this tree, and she had taught it to the people around her. And one of those people, in the course of years and the slow migration of knowledge, had taught it to a man who had then taught it to his daughter. The knowledge had traveled from this tree to her father, and her father had brought it back, through her, to the tree where it began. She was not the first. She was not even the second. She was part of a chain. One link in a sequence of women who had needed this place and found it and survived it and carried what they learned forward into the world. She placed the hide back in the tin. She placed the tin back in its niche. She climbed down. At the entrance to the lower chamber, she paused and she pressed her hand flat against the bark, and she said, very quietly, in the old language, the one her father had spoken, a word that meant approximately thank you, and approximately I understand, and approximately I will carry this forward. Then she went and sat beside the stove and held her daughter's hand in the dark, and she thought about Eliza Marin, and she thought about her father, and she thought about what it meant to be part of something larger than your own survival. The signs came first to Ember. 3 days after Callum's final visit, the dog stopped sleeping. He moved through the hollow in a slow and continuous patrol. From the entrance to the far wall, back to the entrance, a pattern that did not change, regardless of the time of day or the temperature or the amount of food Clara offered him. He ate when given food, but without his usual enthusiasm. His eyes stayed open even when his body was still. Nora noticed before Clara did. Ember is worried about something, she said one morning, watching the dog make his methodical circuit of the chamber. Dogs worry, Clara said, which was not an answer. Not like this, Nora said. He worried about the men from town that came to look at us. But that was different. That was a small worry. This is a big worry. Clara looked at the dog. His path had not varied in 3 days. She went outside. The sky was the color of old pewter, uniformly flat, with no variation in the cloud cover that would indicate movement or passage. The air was still, completely still, the particular stillness that is not calm but suspension, as if the world were holding its breath before something. The cold had a depth to it that went beyond temperature, a heaviness that pressed against the exposed skin of her face with more than its usual insistence. She looked at the tree line at the upper end of the canyon. The branches of the smaller trees were motionless, no wind at all from any direction. She thought about what her father had told her about weather in enclosed valleys, how the stillness before a serious storm was not the absence of the storm, but its leading edge, the atmosphere organizing itself for what was coming, the way a large crowd goes briefly quiet before it erupts. She went back inside. "Nora," she said, "I need to go to town. I'll be back before dark." The town meeting was held in the general store. Bart Cullen stood behind his counter. 8 or 9 men sat on upturned crates and barrels. 2 women stood near the back wall. Edmund was there. He had come, he told Clara quietly as she entered, because he had seen her walking up the canyon trail with the particular stride of someone who has made a decision. Clara stood at the front of the room and said what she had come to say. She described what she had observed. The quality of the stillness, the pressure she could feel in the air, the behavior of the dog over 3 days. She said that in her experience, and in the experience of the people who had taught her to read weather the way other people read text, these conditions preceded a particular kind of storm, not an ordinary winter cold spell, something larger and more sustained, something that would test every structure in this town in ways that would reveal what those structures were actually capable of. She recommended that people bring additional fuel inside, that they check their chimney seals, that they reinforce any north-facing wall that had gaps or cracks. The town doctor said that animal behavior was not a scientific measure of anything. Reverend Whitmore said that the patterns of the natural world were in God's hands, and that preparing for catastrophe without evidence was a form of faithlessness, Bart Cullen said. And the laugh that followed was genuine, which made it worse. "The mole woman is scared of sunshine." She looked at Edmund. He stood up, and the room went slightly quiet in the way that rooms do when Edmund Harlow stands up. "I've built in this territory for 30 years, he said. "I've seen weather that did things to houses I was certain it couldn't do. When a woman who kept a child alive through weeks in a hollow tree in the heart of winter tells me a storm is coming." He looked around the room. I listened to her. No one responded. The silence that followed was not agreement. It was the silence of a room deciding whether to be moved by a fact or to discount it because of who was delivering it. The meeting ended without resolution. Clara stood outside the store in the flat and pressureless cold and looked up at the sky. Edmund came and stood beside her. "You know they won't listen," he said. "Yes. Then why did you come?" She thought about this for a moment. "Because if I hadn't, and the storm came, I would have to carry that too." He looked at her for a long moment. Then they walked back toward the canyon in the failing light. Not together, exactly, but in the same direction, at the same pace, with the same quiet between them that had become, over the days of shared work, something that needed no explanation. At the entrance to the canyon, she turned toward the hollow. He turned toward the town. "Harlow," she said. He stopped. "Check your north wall tonight. Press your palm against the timber and feel what it gives back. If it gives you cold all the way through, bank everything you have against the outside. Your fireplace won't be enough. Nothing in this town will be enough." A pause. "But the wall might buy you time." He looked at her. In the last gray light of the evening, she could not fully read his expression, but she could read the set of his shoulders, the particular tension of a man who is receiving information that contradicts everything he has spent his life building. "I know," he said. She went back to the hollow. The storm came before dawn. There was no gradual approach, no rise in wind or building cloud cover. The night had been utterly still. And then it was not. The change so sudden and so total that Clara, who had been sleeping lightly with one ear always toward the entrance, sat upright in the dark as if she had heard a sound, though what she had heard was more like the absence of the silence she had been listening to. She was at the stove before she was fully awake, feeding it with the careful and measured movements of someone who has made this gesture so many times that it has become the body's own knowledge. 2 logs, placed close but not too close, positioned for maximum surface contact and minimum interference with airflow. She did not rush. Rushing was for people who did not trust what they had built. Outside, the world was coming apart. She could hear it through 3 feet of wood. The storm expressed not as sound, precisely, but as pressure, as a force that moved against every surface simultaneously, that found no gap and no give in the cottonwood's massive body and pressed anyway, with the blind and mechanical persistence of something that does not experience frustration. The tree swayed slightly, a movement so vast and slow that it felt less like motion and more like the tree breathing. It held. Nora woke and sat up and listened. "Is it the storm?" she said. "Yes." Nora absorbed this. She looked at the stove, at the clay walls, at the entrance where the double doors held the outside entirely at bay. "Are we safe?" Clara looked at her daughter. At the directness of the question and the steadiness behind it, a steadiness that was not the absence of fear, but its management, learned over weeks of mornings that had required management. "Yes," she said, "we are safe." Nora lay back down. She pulled Ember against her side. "Okay," she said, and closed her eyes, and within a few minutes, her breathing had slowed back into sleep. Clara sat beside the stove and fed it and listened to the storm try to find a way in, and felt the walls hold everything they had been given, and thought about the people in the town, in their cabins with their thin chinking, and their vast and hungry fireplaces eating wood at a rate that would exhaust their stores within days. She thought about Bart Cullen's children. She thought about Reverend Whitmore. She thought about the old man named Orrin who lived at the end of the South Road, alone, in a cabin with a north wall she had seen him ignore every time someone mentioned it. She fed the stove. She kept the walls warm. She waited. The first knock came after what felt like several hours, though time had become elastic in the total and consuming darkness of the storm. It was more felt than heard. A vibration through the outer door. A transmission of urgency through the wood. Clara opened the inner door, then the outer. The cold came in like a wall. Behind it, barely visible in the white chaos, were 2 shapes, an adult and a child. The child pressed against the adult's body. The adult's face so scoured by wind and ice that the expression beneath it was unreadable. Bart Cullen. And in his arms, his youngest. A small girl named Wren who was the color of old candle wax, and whose eyes were open but not quite focused. He did not speak. He held the child out toward Clara. She stepped back. "Come in," she said. "Both of you. Get warm." They came through. Behind them, the storm closed like a door. Over the following hours, more came. A family of 3 from the north end of town whose roof had given way under the accumulated weight of driven snow. 2 miners whose boarding house had lost its east wall. The minister, Reverend Whitmore, alone, his coat iced over on the windward side, who stood in the entrance of the hollow and looked around at what Clara had built and at the people already sitting inside it, and who said nothing at all for a very long time. Edmund Harlow came last, or near last, ducking through the entrance with Callum beside him. He had found the boy somewhere on the canyon trail. Callum had apparently decided that the directive not to visit Clara did not apply during a catastrophic storm, which was either entirely correct or entirely beside the point. Nora was awake by then. She saw Callum and crossed the chamber in 4 steps and took his arm and pulled him toward the warmest corner, near the stove, without ceremony or explanation, the way children claim the things they value. Edmund stood in the middle of the chamber and looked at Clara. "How many?" he said. 14 now. Maybe more coming." He looked at the stove, at the walls, at the ceiling, counting, calculating, doing the engineering arithmetic that was his native language. "It'll hold," he said. Not a question. "It'll hold," she said. And outside, the storm pressed against 3 feet of ancient living wood with everything it had, and the tree stood, and the warmth inside did not waver. And 14 people breathed the same warm air in the dark, and listened to the world try to come apart, and found that it could not reach them here. Not in this place. Not in this tree. 14 people in a space built for one. Clara had known, in the abstract way that a person knows things they have not yet tested, that the hollow would hold more than herself and Nora. The chamber was nearly 8 feet across at its widest point, and she had always understood it as generous. Generous for one person, adequate for 2. Now she walked its perimeter in her mind and calculated differently. She did not waste time on the calculation. She simply began. "The children go nearest the stove," she said, and her voice carried the particular quality of someone who has stopped asking and started organizing. Not loud, not harsh, simply certain in the way that certainty sounds when it comes from someone who has earned it by being right about things before. People moved. This was the first thing that surprised Edmund, who was watching from near the entrance. Not that they moved, but how quickly and how completely. These were people who had laughed at her, who had passed her eviction notice around the general store with something between amusement and relief. They were rearranging themselves at her direction without a single argument, with the instinctive compliance of people who have just been reminded that competence is the only authority that matters when the walls are shaking. Bart Cullen settled his daughter Wren near the stove and crouched beside her, his large hands useless in the way that hands become useless when the problem cannot be solved by force. He was a man who had built his confidence on commerce and social standing and the particular comfort of being well liked in a small place, and all 3 of those things were completely irrelevant right now, and he knew it in a way that showed plainly in his face. Clara knelt beside Wren. The girl was 5 years old and the color of winter sky, a pale and grayish white that should not have been possible in a living face. Her lips were bloodless. Her eyes were open but moving slowly, tracking without quite focusing, the way eyes move when the body is conserving everything it has for the work of staying alive. Clara had seen this before. Not in a person, in a lamb, once in the old country, when she was 8 years old, and her father had brought a half-frozen animal into the cottage kitchen and laid it on the hearthstones and talked her through what to do in the low and steady voice he used when something mattered. The principle was the same. "Warm water," she said to no one and everyone. "Not hot. Warm. If you heat it too fast, the blood moves back to the surface before the core is ready, and the heart can't manage it." She was already moving, filling the tin cup from the kettle she kept perpetually at the back of the stove. Slow is the only way. She wrapped the cup in a strip of cloth and pressed it between Wren's small hands, curling the child's fingers around it. Then she sat on the floor beside the girl and held the child's hands in hers, the cup between them, and waited. Bart was watching her. His expression had moved past the range of things that have common names. "She'll warm," Clara said. Not reassurance, exactly. Statement of expectation. Children recover faster than we think. Their bodies know what to do. We just have to stop getting in the way. He nodded. He had no words and seemed to understand that he did not need them. The miner named Gideon had come in with the second group, and his hands were the wrong color. Clara saw it when he pressed them against the wall for warmth. The stark and waxen white of fingers that had been too cold for too long. The color of something that has crossed a threshold it cannot easily recross. He was 26 years old, and tough in the way that men become tough who have spent years learning to ignore discomfort. And he was ignoring this with the same practiced discipline, which was exactly the wrong thing to do. "Sit down," she said. He sat down. "Henry worked underground for 9 years, Clara said, filling the basin from the kettle and testing the temperature against the inside of her wrist. "He taught me what happens to hands in the cold, because he needed me to know in case it ever happened to him." She looked at Gideon. "Put your hands in. Don't flex them. Don't try to move them. Let the water do the work." He submerged his hands. The grunt he could not suppress told her more about his pain than anything his face had given away. "Keep them in," she said. "The feeling coming back is going to be worse than the cold was. That's how you know it's working." The organization of 14 people in a small space was less a logistical problem than a social one. The two miners' families had arranged themselves with efficient practicality in the middle section of the chamber, the women trading children back and forth with the seamless coordination of people who have been parenting in difficult circumstances long enough that helping each other's children has become reflex. Callum sat beside Nora, and the two of them were engaged in something that Clara could not quite hear. A quiet and rapid exchange that had the rhythm of problem-solving rather than conversation. Callum had his notebook out. Nora was drawing something on a page with the stub of pencil she kept in her coat pocket, and Callum was annotating around it. Clara watched this for a moment longer than she needed to. Ember moved through the chamber in a continuous and gentle circuit, from child to child, pressing his flank against each small body in turn. He arrived at Wren and stopped. The girl's eyes had sharpened slightly in the past hour, more focused. The color was coming back, faint but present. Ember lay down beside her and pressed his side against her leg and put his chin on his paws, and stayed there with the absolute stillness of an animal that has understood what is needed and decided to provide it. Wren looked at the dog for a long time. Then she reached out and placed her hand, so small it barely covered the width of his neck, against his fur. She did not speak, but her hand stayed there, and slowly, so slowly that it was almost imperceptible, the gray quality began to leave her face. Bart Cullen watched this from across the chamber. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth, and his shoulders moved once. And then he turned to look at the wall, because there was nothing in the wall that would require him to manage what his face was doing. Night settled over the storm. The chamber had become a world, complete and self-sufficient, the chaos outside something that happened to a different reality. People slept in intervals. Children fell asleep first, as children do. The women from the boarding house dozed in shifts. The miners slept the heavy and dreamless sleep of bodies that have been pushed past their usual limits. Reverend Whitmore did not sleep. He sat against the far wall with his knees drawn up and his hands clasped and his eyes moving slowly around the chamber, not the evaluative movement of someone cataloging, but something more internal. The gaze of a man conducting a long and uncomfortable conversation with himself. Clara noticed because she noticed everything in this space. She said nothing for a long time. She fed the stove. She checked Gideon's hands. The color was returning, painful and patchy, but returning. She rearranged the sleeping arrangements of two small children who had migrated in their sleep to positions that would leave them cold by morning. Then she filled a second cup with hot water and brought it to where Reverend Whitmore sat, and set it down beside him, and turned to go. "Mrs. Voss," he said. She stopped. He looked up at her. He had a face that had been handsome once, the kind of face that settled into authority as it aged, and right now it was stripped of authority entirely. Not unpleasant, but exposed, the way a tree looks after its bark has been taken off. "Callum told me about this place," he said, "before I forbade him to come. He described it in the kind of detail a boy uses when he's trying to communicate something he doesn't have the right words for." A pause. "I told him he was exaggerating." Clara said nothing. "He wasn't exaggerating," the Reverend said. She looked at the wall, at the clay surface warm enough to lean against comfortably, at the stove burning with its measured and economical flame. "No," she said, "he wasn't. I told the town you were foolish. I said it from the pulpit, indirectly, in the way that makes it harder to be accountable for." He looked at his hands. "You could have turned us away tonight. Every one of us. You would have been within your rights." "Rights," she said, "are a cold thing to have." He looked up at her. "The people in this room didn't fail me because they were bad," she said. "They failed me because they were afraid, and because being afraid is easier when there's a story to tell yourself about why the person you're failing deserves it." She looked around the chamber, at the sleeping families, at Wren's hand still resting on Ember's neck, at Callum's notebook open on the floor beside him. "I don't need an apology, Reverend. I need people to remember this winter after it's over. I need them to remember it when the next person comes along that the story makes easy to fail." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, with the weight of a man accepting terms of agreement. He knows he has not negotiated well. She left him with the hot water and went back to the stove. It was Edmund who found her sitting alone near the entrance in the deep hours of the night, when the storm outside had settled into a sustained and uniform sound that was almost easier to bear than the gusts had been, because it had stopped surprising her. Most of the chamber was asleep. The candle was down to its last quarter. Clara was sitting with her back against the curve of the inner wall and her eyes open, not quite watching anything, in the way that people sit when they are too tired to sleep and too awake to rest. He crossed the chamber quietly, with the surprising stealth of a large man who has learned to move carefully in spaces where other people are sleeping, and he sat down beside her against the wall. For a while, neither of them said anything. This was the silence of two people who had spent enough time working beside each other that silence had become a form of communication rather than an absence of it. Abigail would have been 28 this winter, he said. Clara did not have to ask who Abigail was. There was only one person who would make Edmund Harlow's voice change in exactly that way. Your daughter, she said quietly, not quite a question. She died in the house I built, the best house in the territory, by every measure I knew how to apply. He was looking at the far wall, at the clay surface glowing faintly with stored warmth. After she was gone, I went through the house room by room. I looked for what I had missed. I found nothing, and that was the worst answer I could have gotten, because it meant I hadn't built it wrong. I had built it correctly, and correctly was not enough. He paused. So I built the walls thicker. I increased the fireplace by a third. I sealed every gap I could find. The cold wasn't the problem, Clara said. No. He shifted his weight against the wall. It was never the shield that failed. It was the idea of the shield. The idea that you fight it, that you resist it, that you build something strong enough to hold the world at bay. He was quiet for a moment. You don't fight it, she said. You become part of it, he said. You learn how it moves, and you move with it. You let it in, only enough, and then you hold it. He looked at the clay wall, the wall she had built. That's what you've been trying to tell me since the first night I stood in this room. A pause. I saw you that first night, he said, dragging the stove through the snow. You were past the mill when I came out of the east door. The rope was cutting into your shoulders. I could see it from 50 feet away. You were bleeding through your coat on the left side. She said nothing. I stood and watched you for a full minute, and then I went inside. His voice was level, but the levelness had a cost she could hear in it. I told myself it wasn't my place, that you hadn't asked for help, that interfering would be condescending. He looked at his hands. I was lying to myself. I went inside because being in the cold, watching a woman drag a cast iron stove through the snow alone, was less comfortable than going inside where I didn't have to see it. Clara looked at him. I know, she said. He looked up sharply. I know you were there, she said. I heard the door. I turned and saw you in the lamplight for a moment before you went in. She held his gaze steadily, without accusation, without the heat of old injury, simply with the clarity of someone stating a fact. I kept pulling. He held her eyes. His face was doing something complicated that she did not try to name. You came back, she said. That matters more. It isn't enough. No, she agreed. It isn't. But it's what we have. And what we have is where everything begins. She turned and looked at the sleeping chamber, at Nora, at Callum, at Wren, with her hand still on the dog's neck, at all the people who had needed this place and found it. Everything good I have, I built from what was available, not what I wished I had. What was there? He was quiet for a long time. Then, slowly, his hand found hers in the dark. Not a dramatic gesture, not a declaration, simply the movement of a hand that has calculated the distance to something it needs and covered it. His fingers were large and rough and warm. She did not move away. They sat like that in the deep cold of the storm's middle hours, in the warm hollow of an ancient tree, while the world outside exhausted itself against everything it could not reach, and the stove burned its careful and measured fire, and 14 people breathed the air she had made warm enough to breathe. The miracle, when it came quietly, Nora's fever had come on slowly, the way fevers do in children who have been cold and hungry and tired for weeks. Not a sudden spike, but a gradual accumulation. By the time Clara had registered it fully, in the midst of organizing 14 people in a storm, it had been running for 6 hours. She had treated it with what she had: cool water on the wrists and forehead, the dried willow bark she kept in the tin on the upper shelf, a tea made from the stores she had been building since the first week. She had done these things between other tasks, in the moments she could carve out, trusting the treatment because her mother had taught it to her, and her mother had learned it from someone who had learned it from someone else. A chain of knowledge that had been trusted and verified across more generations than she could count. She sat with Nora in the hours before dawn, holding her daughter's hand, listening to her breathe. The fever broke as the darkness began to thin. It did not break dramatically. There was no crisis and no crisis point. The quality of Nora's breathing simply changed, deepened, slowed, settled into the particular rhythm of someone whose body has stopped fighting and started resting, which is the rhythm that follows recovery rather than the rhythm that precedes surrender. She pressed her lips against her daughter's forehead. Cool, not cold. Cool in the way of clean water, of morning air, of something that has returned from somewhere difficult. "Mama," Nora said, without opening her eyes. Her voice was hoarse and small, but present, fully present, in the specific way that presence returns after absence. The tree kept us warm. Clara could not speak for a moment. "Yes," she said, when she could. "It did." "Did it keep everyone warm?" She looked around the chamber, at the sleeping shapes, at the rise and fall of breathing, at Ember, who had moved at some point in the night to place himself precisely between Nora and the entrance, his body a living barrier. "Everyone," she said. Nora's hand tightened on hers. "Good," she said, and went back to sleep. The storm ended the way great storms end in fiction and in life alike. Not with a dramatic conclusion, but with a gradual lessening. The fury running out of itself, the pressure dropping, the sound retreating by degrees until the silence came back and settled over the canyon like something remembered. Clara knew it was over before anyone else did, because she had been listening to it from the inside for so long that she had learned its voice the way you learn the voice of something you have been living beside. She opened the outer door. The air that came in was cold, but different. Passive rather than aggressive, the cold of aftermath rather than the cold of assault. Above the canyon rim, the sky was beginning to lighten. Not the flat pewter of the storm's pressure, but actual light. The pale silver gray that precedes a winter dawn. The sky doing what it always does on the other side of something terrible, opening again. She stood in the entrance and breathed. Edmund came and stood beside her at the entrance. He looked out at the world the storm had left. The canyon transformed, the familiar shapes of stone and tree buried under a depth of snow that made the landscape look both simplified and absolute, reduced to its essential geometries. 17 people, he said, not an observation, an accounting. 17, she confirmed. He turned and looked back into the chamber, at the people moving slowly into wakefulness, at Callum helping a small child sit upright, at Bart Cullen leaning over Wren with the expression of a man who has spent a night revising every assumption he has made about what matters, at Reverend Whitmore, who was sitting very straight against the far wall with the look of someone who has arrived at a conclusion he cannot take back. "What happens now?" Edmund said. Clara looked at the lightening sky. "Now," she said, "we go and see what's left, and then we figure out what to build." She stepped out into the snow. The cold touched her face like something familiar, known and navigable, the cold of a world she understood and had learned to work with rather than against. Above her, the ancient cottonwood stood in the pale morning light exactly as it had always stood, massive, unhurried, its bare branches holding their customary arrangement against the brightening sky. It had not moved. It had not bowed. It had done what it had been doing for longer than anyone in the territory could accurately measure. It had held. She put her hand on the bark as she passed, briefly, without stopping. The gesture of someone acknowledging a companion rather than a tool. The wood was cold on the surface and warm 3 feet in, and she knew this without pressing hard enough to feel it, because she had learned it well enough that her hand remembered. The tree had stood for 100 years before she found it. She thought, with a certainty she could not have justified by any argument but did not need to, that it would stand for 100 more. The town the storm left behind was not the same town that had existed before it. This was true in the obvious physical sense. The drifts that had buried fence posts to their tops, the roof lines that had shed their snow in uneven avalanches, leaving exposed rafters open to the sky. The general store's east-facing window blown clean through and filled now with a solid block of packed snow that Bart Cullen would spend 3 days removing. The landscape of the town had been rearranged by something that did not ask permission, and the rearrangement was thorough. But the other change was harder to see and more significant. It moved through the town the way warmth moves through clay. Slowly, by contact, one person at a time. The miners' wives spoke of it at the well. The men referenced it obliquely at the mill. Reverend Whitmore said something from the pulpit the following week that was not an apology, because the language available to him did not include a direct apology without also including an explanation, and any explanation would have diminished the apology. And he understood this well enough to simply say, "I was wrong about what the cold requires of us. I was wrong about what strength looks like in a woman. I will not make that error again." It was, for a sermon, remarkably brief. Clara heard about it from Edmund, who had been there, and who repeated it to her in the same low and even tone he used for structural assessments. Not editorializing, simply reporting, as if the information were load-bearing and needed to be delivered without embellishment. She was mortaring a new section of the outer wall when he told her, reinforcing the sod berm that had shifted slightly under the storm's weight, and she listened without stopping her hands. "He means it," Edmund said. "I know," she said. "That doesn't make it simple." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She pressed clay into the gap between 2 sections of sod and smoothed it with the heel of her palm. Simple would be if none of it had happened. What we have instead is what came after, which is harder to work with, but more honest. He watched her hands for a moment. "You've always known that. My father used to say that the truth of a material isn't what it looks like when it's new. It's what it does under pressure." She sat back on her heels and looked at the wall. People are a material. The old man named Orrin had lived at the end of the South Road, alone, in a cabin with a north wall that everyone had seen him ignore every time someone mentioned it. They found him 3 days after the storm ended. He was in his chair beside the cold hearth, his hands in his lap, his face composed. He had burned everything combustible he owned, including the boards from the floor, and it had not been enough. Clara heard this from Callum, who told it to her with the careful and precise language of someone reporting something they are still processing. The words accurate, the voice controlled, the eyes doing the work that the voice was not doing. She sat with this for a long time. She was not surprised. She had known, in the way that people know things they cannot act on, that the storm would reach someone who could not be reached in time. She had gone to the town meeting. She had knocked on doors. She had done what was available to her, and it had not been enough. She thought about the night of the meeting, about Oren's face in the crowd. Polite, unhurried, the face of a man who has decided he already knows how the story ends. She had not pushed harder. She had not gone to his door a second time. She had done what was available to her, and it had not been enough. And she would carry that the same way she carried Henry. Not as a wound to be nursed, but as a weight that was simply hers now. A reminder that knowing something is true and making someone believe it are not the same thing. They have never been the same thing. She stood there until she was certain she had looked at it directly and completely, without flinching. Then she went back to work. Silas Crane came on a morning when the snow had compacted to a firm crust, and the sky was the particular blue that follows a serious storm, high and clear and entirely without warmth, as if the storm had scoured all ambiguity from the atmosphere and left only the cleanest and most unforgiving version of winter. He came alone. This was itself a statement. He had always arrived before with someone beside him, a witness or a functionary or a physical expression of authority. Coming alone meant he was not here on company business. He was here as himself, and Clara understood this before he spoke. She was outside the hollow, splitting wood, when he came down the canyon trail. She heard him before she saw him, and continued splitting. When he stopped at the edge of the clearing, she buried the axe in the splitting block and turned and looked at him. He was thinner than she remembered. The storm had not spared his cabin. She had heard this from Edmund, and the weeks of cold had taken something from him that had not come back. He looked like a man who has spent a long time carrying something he had not expected to be as heavy as it turned out to be. He did not come further into the clearing. He stood at the edge of it, and they looked at each other across the distance between them, and the canyon was very quiet. "Fitch is filing the land claim in your name," he said. "The proper one. It'll go through without opposition." "I know," she said. "Edmund told me." A silence. "The letter Henry wrote," Silas said, "about the shale. Fitch has a copy now." "Yes." He looked at the tree, at the hollow, at the outer door she had built, at the cleared area around it, and the woodpile, and the stone-lined path between the entrance and the creek. He looked at it, the way a man looks at something he expected to be a ruin and finds instead to be a thing built and maintained and lived in. "You outlasted me," he said. It was not an apology. It was not a capitulation in the dramatic sense, not the falling to his knees, not the explicit recounting of his wrongs, not the tearful acknowledgement that stories sometimes provide because stories are built to satisfy. It was simply the statement of a man who had calculated the distance between where he stood and where he had thought he would stand, and found it did not resolve in his favor. "Then go," Clara said. He held her gaze for 3 heartbeats. Then he turned and walked back up the canyon trail, his boots breaking through the crust in the clean and regular rhythm of departure, and he did not look back. She watched him until the canyon's curve took him from sight. Then she pulled the axe from the splitting block and went back to work. Edmund came that afternoon with Fitch, and the land document was signed in the hollow with Nora and Callum as witnesses. Nora because she lived there, and Callum because he happened to be present, which he usually was now, his father's prohibition having quietly dissolved in the aftermath of a storm that had rearranged more than the landscape. Fitch departed with the document. Edmund stayed. He had brought something with him, a set of tools wrapped in canvas, heavier than his usual kit, which he set down near the entrance without explanation, and then looked at Clara with the expression of a man who has rehearsed something and is deciding whether the rehearsed version is actually what he wants to say. There is a section of wall on the north side of the hollow that I want to reinforce before the next cold spell, he said. The sod there has a weak point where the ground is lower. I've been thinking about how to address it, and I have an approach I'd like your opinion on. Clara looked at him. That's not what you came to say, she said. He held her gaze. No, he said. It isn't. He looked at the tools in his hands, at the canvas wrapping, then back at her. I know how to build things that last. That's what I know. It's the most honest thing I can tell you about myself. A pause. I would like to build something with you, if you're willing. Nora was sitting on the stone platform near the stove, ostensibly focused on her slate, definitely not reading what was written on it. Ember was sitting beside her with the alert and interested posture of a dog following a conversation he finds significant. The silence lasted several seconds. I'll look at the north wall, Clara said, and then we'll talk about the rest. It was not a yes, precisely. It was something more valuable. It was an opening, which is always where the best things begin. Spring came the way it always does in that kind of country, slowly and disputedly, yielding ground to winter in increments while simultaneously reclaiming it, so that any given day might feel like either season depending on what the light was doing. The cottonwood was the first thing to show it. Its branches, bare for months, began to swell at the tips. Small tight buds that were almost the same color as the wood and only visible if you were standing close and looking with intention. Clara noticed them on a morning when the air had a new quality to it, a slight softening that was not warmth, but the suggestion of warmth, the memory of warmth returning from wherever it had spent the winter. She stood at the entrance to the hollow and looked up at the crown of the tree for a long time. Then she went inside and told Nora to put on her coat. Edmund came with them, and Callum, and together the four of them walked into the forest above the canyon, climbing to where the older trees grew. Clara moved among them with the ease of someone in a familiar language, her hands finding the bark she wanted to show, her voice doing what it did when she was teaching. Low, precise, without the false enthusiasm of someone performing knowledge, because genuine knowledge doesn't need performance. She showed them the grain of a standing dead tree and what it revealed about the direction of the prevailing wind. She showed them the difference between rot and heartwood loss, between a tree that was dying and a tree that was hollow and vital. She showed them how to knock and listen, how to read the resonance, how to understand what a tree was doing inside its skin. Nora asked questions in the quick and precise way she asked everything, not because she doubted, but because asking was how she absorbed. Callum wrote in his notebook, his pencil moving fast, capturing not just the facts, but the language she used, the particular way she framed things, which he had understood contained the knowledge as much as the content did. Edmund watched. He did not write and did not ask questions. That was how he learned. By watching, by letting the information organize itself against the framework of everything he already knew, finding where it changed the framework and where it confirmed it. "My father taught me all of this," Clara said at one point, her hand on the bark of a very old maple. His father taught him, and the woman who taught his father, before the ocean, before the journey, before any of us, left her mark on a tree in a canyon that I found when I had nowhere else to go. She looked at Callum's notebook, at Nora's face, at Edmund's steady attention. "The only way knowledge survives is if it keeps moving, if someone receives it and decides it's worth passing on." Callum looked down at his notebook. "I've been thinking about making a proper record, not just my notes, a real document, something that could be used to teach others how to build the way you build." "You have been making a real document," Clara said, "since the first day you came to the Hollow." He looked at his notebook, and the expression on his face was the particular surprise of someone who has been told that the thing they thought they were practicing was, in fact, the thing itself. The wedding was held in the Hollow. This had been Nora's suggestion, delivered with the pragmatic certainty of a child who has identified the logical answer and cannot understand why adults require so long to arrive at it. It was their place. It was where they lived. It was where everything that mattered had happened. Why would they go somewhere else? Neither Clara nor Edmund had an adequate counter-argument, so they did not try. It was a small ceremony. Reverend Whitmore read from the book he always read from, but briefly, and with an economy of language that Clara suspected cost him more than the brevity suggested. The miners' families were there. Bart Cullen was there, standing near the back with Wren on his hip, the girl's small hand wrapped around his collar. Callum stood beside Nora, both of them solemn, with the studied gravity of young people performing an important witnessing function. Ember slept through most of it, which was appropriate. Afterward, standing outside in the spring air with the canyon walls holding the early warmth against the stone, Edmund reached down and took Clara's hand in the same simple and deliberate way he had reached for it in the dark of the storm's worst night. "You know I'm going to keep finding things wrong with your construction," he said. "I know," she said, "and you're going to be wrong about half of them." He looked at the hollow, at the great curved trunk, at the entrance above which the initials EM were barely visible now beneath the growth of lichen and new bark. "What do you think she was like?" he said. "The woman who was here before you." Clara thought about the piece of hide, about the knotted cloth, about a woman who had crossed an ocean and survived something unsurvivable and carried what she learned back into the world. "Stubborn," she said. "Practical. Better at listening to things than people expected." She looked at the carved initials. "Like everyone who finds this place, I imagine." He was quiet for a moment. "And the next one? After you?" She looked at Nora, who was crouched near the base of the tree, showing something in the bark to Wren. Some detail that required pointing and explanation and the focused and serious attention that Nora brought to things she considered important, which was most things. "She already knows the way in," Clara said. "Years moved the way years move when the days inside them are full. Quickly in memory, slowly in the living of them." The town grew in the gradual and unremarkable way of frontier settlements that have decided to persist. More buildings, more families, the slow accumulation of permanence. Edmund's retrofitted houses stood through winters that tested them and did not find them wanting. Callum's notebooks became a document, and the document found readers, and the readers built things, and the things stood. Nora grew up the way her mother had hoped and the way her father would have recognized, with her hands knowing things before her mind had finished explaining them to itself, with a capacity for stillness in difficult situations that people who had not grown up in a hollow tree found remarkable, and people who had found entirely natural. She became, in time, the kind of person that people came to when they were sick, and when the herbs they needed grew in places only she knew. She taught what she knew to anyone who asked, and she asked nothing in return except the same attention she gave. Complete, unhurried, present. Callum became the kind of man who builds things that last because he understands why they should last, which is a different foundation than the one Edmund had started with and produced, ultimately, a different quality of structure. He and Nora were friends in the particular way of two people who learned important things at the same time in the same place. A friendship that required no maintenance because it was built of something that did not age. Ember lived a long life for a dog of uncertain origins and improbable resilience. He slept near the stove through more winters than Clara could count, growing slower and stiffer, but never entirely relinquishing the role of guardian. Still raising his head at unfamiliar sounds, still placing himself between Nora and the entrance when the weather changed. When he died in the hollow, in the same warm corner he had occupied since the first night Nora had convinced Clara to let him in from the cold. They buried him at the base of the cottonwood, on the south side where the spring sun reached first, and the marker Nora carved into a piece of creekstone said only what needed to be said. He kept watch. He was faithful. In the last year of her life, Clara was sitting at the entrance to the hollow on an afternoon in early autumn when her granddaughter found her there. The girl was 8 years old, Nora's eldest, with her grandmother's directness and her father's patience, and the particular quality of curiosity that the family seemed to produce in its children like a recurring trait, focused, unafraid of the answer. She sat down beside Clara and looked at the canyon, at the trees in their early autumn color, at the light doing what autumn light does in the late afternoon, turning everything to a quality of gold that makes ordinary things look like they are explaining themselves. "Were you ever scared?" she said. Clara looked at her granddaughter, at the directness of the question, the most honest question anyone had asked her in years, possibly because children are the only people who ask the most honest questions without calculating the cost of the answer. "Every single day," she said. The girl absorbed this. "But you stayed anyway." "Staying and being afraid aren't opposites," Clara said. "Your great-grandfather taught me that. Darkness isn't the enemy. Cold isn't the enemy. The story you tell yourself about them, that is the only thing that can stop you." She looked at the entrance to the hollow, at the carved initials above it, worn now to shadows in the bark, but still legible to someone who knew where to look. "I was terrified the first night I went in there, terrified every day for a long time after, but the tree didn't ask me to stop being afraid. It just asked me to come inside." The girl was quiet for a moment. Then, "Will you teach me? What great-great-grandfather taught you?" Clara looked at her granddaughter for a long time, At her hands, which were her mother's hands, practical, observant, already knowing things. At her eyes, which were patient in the way of someone who is genuinely prepared to wait for the answer to the thing she is asked. Yes, she said. She stood up slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a body that has earned its slowness and is not ashamed of it. She held out her hand. Come, I want to show you a living tree. Long after Clara Voss was gone, the cottonwood still stood. It stood the way it had always stood, without announcement, without requiring acknowledgement, with the absolute and simple permanence of something that has been doing the same thing for so long that the doing of it has become indistinguishable from existence itself. Inside the hollow, in the high niche where the heartwood had pulled away from the outer shell, the tin box remained, the hide with its drawing, the knotted cloth, Henry's wedding ring, placed there by Clara in the first winter, in a gesture she had explained to no one while she lived, and that Nora had found and understood, without explanation, after she was gone. And beside these things, folded small, a piece of paper in Clara's handwriting. The clear and careful hand of a woman who had learned to write from a father who believed that writing things down was the only reliable way to make sure they survived the person who knew them. It said, "To whoever finds this, the tree will hold you. Trust it. And when you are warm again, pass it on. Outside the canyon, in the world that kept moving the way the world does, regardless of what any individual life contains, people built things. Some of those things lasted and some did not. And the ones that lasted did so for reasons that could be traced, if you were willing to trace them, back to a set of principles that had traveled a long way to arrive where they were needed. The earth never lies." That was what the principles said at their core. Not in those words, because the principles were expressed in wood and clay and the specific angle of a chimney bend, but in that meaning. The earth never lies, and neither do the walls you build with your own hands. This is a work of fiction. Clara Voss, Edmund Harlow, Silas Crane, and all characters in this story are imagined. The hollow tree exists only in the country that stories inhabit, which is perhaps the most durable country of all. If you are facing your own storm right now, whatever form it takes, whatever it is trying to take from you, remember her. She was afraid every single day. She stayed anyway, and the tree held.